On the morning of April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt awoke at 9:20 a.m. and had a light breakfast. He complained of a mild headache and some neck stiffness. Despite it being warm and humid, FDR felt a chill and asked for a warm cape to be draped on his shoulders. As FDR read the newspapers and wrote a few letters at a card table that served as his desk, artist Elizabeth Shumatoff began painting his portrait. At 1 p.m. he told her they only had 15 more minutes before they were to eat lunch. He lit a cigarette, then raised his left hand to his forehead and pressed. Suddenly his hand fell, with his fingers twitching, and murmured, "I have a terrific headache." Then Roosevelt's arm fell to his side, his head sagged, and his entire body slumped in the chair. It was 1:15 p.m. Roosevelt stopped breathing for a few seconds. The president's blood pressure had skyrocketed, and one of his eyes was dilating uncontrollably. The president had suffered what would be called a massive cerebral hemorrhage. At 3:35 p.m., President Franklin Roosevelt died on his small bed. Vice President Harry Truman had been presiding over the Senate that afternoon. It adjourned for the day at 4:56 p.m., and the White House reached him and told him to come there immediately through the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance. He was met by Eleanor Roosevelt, who put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." When Truman asked what he could do for Mrs. Roosevelt, she replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? You are the one in trouble now." She also cabled her 4 sons who were serving in the military. Franklin D. Roosevelt began his journey home the following morning. A military procession from nearby Fort Benning escorted the hearse down the hill from the little White House to Georgia Hall, with other soldiers lining the roadway. A military band softly played dirges. Where there were usually joyous shouts as Roosevelt departed, now there was only the sound of anguished moans and bitter tears. Graham Jackson, a musician who often played for Roosevelt, stepped from the crowd. With tears streaming down his face, he played Going Home on his accordion. The train pulled out from Warm Springs around 9:05 a.m. The windows on the train car holding Roosevelt's coffin were left open, making it easily visible. Moving no faster than 35 miles per hour, the train passed through South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Thousands turned out to pay their respects to the passing funeral train. Eleanor Roosevelt was deeply moved as she witnessed just how strongly the people loved him. The funeral train arrived at Union Station in Washington on April 14th, where 500,000 people turned out to see Roosevelt's casket. It was drawn by 7 white horses in a mile-long funeral procession to the White House. Full military honors were rendered in the motorcade from the railroad station to the White House, where the casket was placed in the East Room. The Episcopal funeral service was conducted at 4 o'clock. That evening, the casket was taken in a small procession of soldiers and police back to the Union Station for his final trip home to Hyde Park. When the train rolled out of Washington that evening, it was 18 cars long and carried the new president, Harry Truman, and his family, the presidential cabinet, all 9 justices of the Supreme Court, and almost every top-ranking government official. A second train followed, bearing more dignitaries, diplomats, and congressmen, as well as 5 truckloads of flowers. In all, about 140 of the country's most powerful people were together in a few Pullman dining cars and staterooms. The morning of April 15th, at 9:58 a.m., the funeral train arrived at a siding on the Hudson River 4 miles from the Roosevelt home, marked by 2 howitzer blasts 15 seconds apart. The casket was transferred to a gun carriage and taken to the Roosevelt estate along a route lined with soldiers, sailors, and Marines. The caisson was preceded by a military band and a battalion of West Point cadets, and followed by limousines containing President Truman and the Roosevelt family. Full military honors were rendered from the train to the burial site. Hundreds of people traveled to Hyde Park to attend the funeral. Interment was in the Rose Garden at the estate in Hyde Park. The funeral started at 10:34. The rector of St. James Episcopal Church, Reverend George W. Anthony, read the burial services. They were a quick 17 minutes, ending at 10:51. Years before, Roosevelt had chosen the spot in his Hyde Park garden where he wanted to be buried. As the coffin was slowly lowered into the ground, Reverend Anthony intoned, "Now the laborer's task is o'er. Now the battle day is past. Now upon the farther shore lands the voyager at last. Father, in thy gracious keeping, leave me now, thy servant sleeping." West Point cadets advanced and fired a 3-volley salute, and the long finality of taps was sounded by Army Sergeant Newell Fisher as the casket was lowered into its final resting place. After each round of volleys were sounded, Falla barked, an unconscious salute of his own to his master, Margaret Suckley wrote in her diary. Upon his death, the New York Times wrote of the deceased president, "Men will thank God on their knees 100 years from now that Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the White House. It was his hand, more than that of any other single man, that built the great coalition of the United Nations. It was his leadership which inspired free men in every part of the world to fight with greater hope and courage. Gone is the fresh and spontaneous interest which this man took, as naturally as he breathed air, in the troubles and the hardships and the disappointments and the hopes of little men and humble people."